I am Daisy, your hostess. If you just found me at this video, welcome. And to my fellow subscribers, welcome back. I must say, I don't know if I admire more your stickability to see this book through with me, or your compassion in not leaving me to do it by myself. Either way, thank you. It appears to me that the author wants to make a case for the Romanies as to the scattered people prophesied in the Bible, and in so doing, he invited us into his world and his interactions with Roma people of the mid-1800s in England where he lived. The book is titled The Gypsies, Their Origin, Continuance, and Destination, as clearly foretold in the Prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezequiel by Samuel Roberts. This window into the past allowed us to see the discrimination and challenges that the Romanies dealt with then, and sad to say, many are dealing with today. We don't have to go too far to see the truth of this. Simply pull up recent news on Romanies, and soon you'll see for yourself that as of 2024, Romani migration in Europe continues to be marked by ongoing challenges related to discrimination and limited access to opportunities and adequate housing. It may be subjective on my part, but it appears that for all the religion in the world that preach brotherly love, it has yet to show any. There is a saying that suggests to practice what we preach, but I find more beautiful when we make our life the prayer. Prayer here to be defined as your way of life, not just to walk the talk, but more so that your walk speaks your talk. I believe cultivating spirit is beautiful. Whatever means you use to get you there is for you to discover. And there are many treasures and golden stepping stones that help us discover that deeper part of ourselves through life's experiences and challenges. And perhaps this author may have been familiar with the prayer of St. Francis, which starts as follows. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Some of you may know the rest. Sometimes it seems to me that we humans show more compassion to animals than we do to each other. I don't think I digress too much, so let me circle back here. The author, Samuel Roberts, in the previous chapter, in the last video, discussed the Jews as it relates to dispersion and the Gypsies. He was showing the similarities and peculiarities of these two peoples, clearly both on opposite spectrums, yet were both displaced and both persecuted. I was going through some of the history of the Romanies, and it is documented that over 500,000 Gypsy Romanies were put to death in concentration camps along with Jews, going down in history as the forgotten Holocaust. In their persecution and dispersion, we find similarities. Yet the author said their differences, and I may be too quick to point out that he came across to me as judgmental in stating that once the Jews settle in a region, they put their mind to acquiring wealth, suggesting that the Jews idolize wealth as their golden calf, of which idolatry was the reason the Lord, their God, brought them out of Egypt. I personally cringed when the author suggested that in embracing Christianity, the Jews should be asked to relinquish, as he put it, worldly advantage. And he added, quote, the Christianity which has these for its objects can have nothing of vital Christianity appertaining to it, end quote. I take pause here to research the financial books of the Vatican only because many say that the Catholic Church is one of the biggest denomination in the biggest religion group and said to be one of the wealthiest. And according to marketplace.org, I'm leaving the resource links in the description of this video, they stated, recently, the Catholic Church alone has at least 73 billion in assets, including billions in real estate and also in priceless art. The article mentioned one piece of artwork owned by the Vatican, painted by Vincent van Gogh, known as Pietà. It is a 4.5 centimeter by 34 centimeter painting that shows the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ after his crucifixion. that painting is said to go for only $40 million to $50 million, not to mention the Vatican Bank holdings. Marketplace stated its finances are largely secret. Tallying that immense wealth is pretty much impossible according to experts. I'm going to say no more because I might just sulk for a bit trying to understand the human condition or trying to make sense of the hypocrisy of it all. And this is where I had to dig hard to see this mission through in reading this book, when the author, in his attempt to show us the scattered people of the Bible, suggested we show them the nature of true Christianity. Mind you, historically, Christianity burned and tortured people who practiced any form of pagan worship. And perhaps it's my police background that can draw the line between identifying a criminal act and religious fanaticism. And any act, in my opinion, that puts any life in peril should not be tolerated, and that line should be drawn immediately. And perhaps it is the antiquarian part of Christianity or religion when way back when, historically, church and state and science were one. I mean, your priests were your doctors, your financial advisors were your guidance for the government, your police. And that division happened, I don't know how many years ago, but we can look that up, where church and state separated. Yet there's still some strong arm there in the church or in religion as far as powers that be. And that's a whole different book and a whole different thing to look at. So I just said, it's a fine line between a criminal act and religious fanaticism, and any act, in my opinion, that puts any life in peril should not be tolerated, and that line should be drawn immediately. Religions that require a sacrifice, in my opinion, should use a proxy, such as an apple or a watermelon, I think, or I'd like to believe that we are way past that. Funny thing is, the author, while talking about how the Jews were so oppressed and massacred, posed the question as to what happened to those that oppressed the Jews. Where are they now? And in one swift stroke of the pen said, they have been swept from their seats of power, their palaces, their temples, swept away from the face of the earth. Clearly, this is a message. Either history repeats itself, or there is some greater divine intervention that has not a thing to do with religion, but I pray that it has to do with something within the spirit of man that seeks higher ground. And here, with these similarities and peculiarities, I do agree with the author as it pertains with the Jews and the Romanies, who the Jews, by their religious observations, have been persecuted the more so, and the Romanies, who by their detachment of worldly things have remained in an odd way for years a distinct people. And we have reached in my recap of the previous chapter. Let's now turn the page to the next chapter. Conclusion. From the second book of Peter, chapter 3, verse 8 and 9. Quote, "The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness. For 1 day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day." End quote. Circumstances have for a long time been conducing to draw the attention of the world, the Christian world in particular, to the subject here treated of. A strong conviction is becoming very prevalent that the long predicted events relating to the Jews are fast and nearly approaching. Whether then that prediction be well or ill-founded, a supposition such as I have brought forward respecting the Gypsies cannot, I think, be treated with indifference. This inquiry seems indeed naturally to lead to the investigation of many other parts of God's government of the world, even from the creation itself, to which, in its commencement, it so nearly approximates. More particularly, it leads to the contemplation of man in his subsequent advancement, even from the first steps in civilization, knowledge, and holiness. The information which it hath pleased Almighty God to afford us of man and occurrences in paradise, or even before the flood, are scanty and brief indeed. We are therefore bound to believe that more was unnecessary. A single page contains the first, and a very few more the whole of the latter, though comprising the history of the world during 2,000 years. That men were born, had certain names given them, lived, had children, and died, comprises almost the whole of the records respecting that first period in the existence of our fallen race. What might have been the condition of the inhabitants of paradise had man continued in a state of innocence, obedient to the commands of his Creator, we know but little. Whether the paradisical tests of his obedience, as related to us, be literally described, or only figuratively, is but of perhaps a little importance. One thing, however, is clear. Man was a being possessed of free will, capable of choosing the good and rejecting the evil. It is likewise clear that happiness was the reward of obedience, and that he lost it because he transgressed the command. The duty required, like all which God enjoins, was in its nature a blessing, and so easy that it could in its performance merit nothing. The gift then, though conditional, was clearly of grace, but being given, the reward for obedience was as certain as it would have been had the task enjoined been infinitely more important than it was. It is likewise clear that had man continued obedient, he would not have been subject to death, but would have enjoyed everlasting happiness. But having by disobedience forfeited this blissful inheritance, God seems to have decreed a total and dreadful change in his state on earth. Debased in his nature, and doomed to more or less of inevitable sin and misery during life, he was to suffer the penalty of his offenses, hereby a painful removal from his state of existence. It, however, appears to have been the will of the Almighty, with whom 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day, gradually to elevate man on earth till he should, when the fullness of time was come, be enabled to attain eternal felicity, at least equal to that which might have been enjoyed by him had he remained obedient in paradise. What man was, immediately subsequent to the fall, or even during the almost 2,000 years preceding the deluge, we know little. That he was very inferior to what he is now appears, however, very evident. Though most of the human inhabitants of this earth lived then from 500 to almost 1,000 years, and therefore must have increased in numbers very rapidly, the advancement that was made by them in arts, sciences, and general civilization seems to bear no proportion to the advancement that they made in the same, in a fourth part of the period subsequent to the flood, when cities of vast extent and almost inconceivable splendor and strength were soon erected. The utmost that we learn of the works of the antediluvians is that Enoch built a city, and that Jabal, Tubal-Cain, and Jubal, who were brethren living 1,500 years after the fall, were the fathers of such as dwell in tents, of such as have cattle, of such who work in iron and brass, and of all such as handle the harp and the organ, whatever those instruments might then be. The progress of the antediluvians in wickedness seems to have been the greatest advancement that they made. In fact, they appear to me, to the last, to have proceeded scarcely beyond that line of civilization within which we should now include the lowest of our species. The first great step, then, which by God's appointment occurred in man's advancement was at the deluge. After that event, his intellectual progress seems to have been rapid and great. A question here occurs, which is at least highly curious, if not greatly important. Were Noah and his family Negroes? Or in what degree were they removed from being so? From them, we are taught to believe that all subsequent human beings have sprung. All deviations, then, from them which now exist, whatever they may be, must have taken place since then, as it clearly appears to have been the plan of divine providence, gradually to advance mankind both in external and internal good qualities and acquirements, and as within modern times many instances have occurred of the native colored inhabitants of various countries being extirpated and replaced by whites, does it not seem probable that the unenlightened inhabitants of an antediluvian world were Negroes? And that finally that race of human beings will cease to exist? In corroboration of this supposition of the gradual advancement of mankind from Negroes of different degrees of what we now consider finer skins, features, and forms, I insert the following extract from a work entitled The Costume of Ancients by Thomas Hope, Volume 2, London, 1812, page 1. The ancient Egyptians were descended from the Ethiopians, and while their blood remained free from any mixture with that of European or Asiatic nations, their race seems to have retained obvious traces of the aboriginal Negro form and features. Not only do the human figures in their colored hieroglyphics display a deep swarthy complexion, but every Egyptian monument, whether statue, bas-relief, presents the splayed feet, the spreading toes, the bow-bent shins, the high meager calves, the long swinging arms, the sharp shoulders, the square flat heads, the head when seen profile, placed not vertically but obliquely on the spine, the jaws and chin consequently very prominent, together with skinny lips, depressed nose, high cheekbones, large unhemmed ears, raised far above the level of the nostrils, and all the other peculiarities characteristic of the Negro conformation. It is true, the practice prevalent among the Egyptians of shaving their heads and beards close to the skin, which they only deviated from when in mourning, seldom allows their statues to show that most undeniable symptom of Negro extraction, the woolly hair. The heads of their figures generally appeared covered with some sort of cap, or when bare, closely shaven. In the few Egyptian sculptured personages, however, in which the hair is introduced, it uniformly offers the woolly texture and the short, crisp curls of that of the Negroes. Nor do I know a single specimen of genuine Egyptian workmanship in which are seen any indications of the long, sleek hair or loose, wavy ringlets of European or Asiatics. A writer in the British and Foreign Review for April 1836 on Egypt says, "It may appear surprising, but perhaps it would scarcely derogate from the physical beauty of the Egyptian people, male and female, if we ascribe to them the Negro features, that is, the undergraded Negro features as represented on the monuments. They are black and have woolly hair, it is true, but they are decidedly the finest men of all the varieties of the human species which have been exhibited. They are superior in profile, in deportment, in attitude, and in figure. This is a consideration deserving the notice of the advocates of Negro slavery. They are, in fact, not the Negroes blasphemously supposed by them to have the mark of Cain inflicted on them. Brutalized by long ages of misgovernment in their own country, and degraded by the branding iron and the lash of their European taskmasters in the West Indies. But Negroes, such as late travelers have described in St. Domingo, where the chains of slavery have been a long time broken, and the Negro child has drawn his first breath in freedom. They are the Negroes such as they were originally formed and as they come from the hands of their Maker." We now leave that consideration to physiognomists. The moral effects of slavery and degraded habits, or vice versa, in depressing or elevating the scale of physical beauty, is quite worthy of their attention. Quote, "We have said that there are some exceptions to the general rule that the Egyptian people were not distinguished by the Negro character. Two of the exceptions are singularly in accordance with the foregoing remarks. They relate to Memnon and his mother. It was often discussed and inferred from the circumstances of Memnon being called black by Virgil, corroborated by the designation employed by Herodotus respecting the Egyptians of their being black with crisped hair, that Memnon was a Negro. That fact, as we have shown, would not preclude him from being the handsomest man next to Achilles at the siege of Troy, but by a curious accident, proved by the illustrations of Rossellini and Champollion, it is now ascertained that Memnon was half a Negro, his mother being an actual negress. His mother, wherever represented, is not only black, but always exhibits the purely Negro character. And Minon himself, though only half a Negro in blood, approaches the Negro in his facial outline, as may be readily seen by a copy of the great statue of the Plain of Thebes, now in the British Museum, more than any of the entire line of native Egyptian princes." End quote. Great, however, as the step appears to have been which, at or immediately after the flood, man seems to have been enabled to take towards a state of greater perfection, it was but a very trifling one to what had at the fall been promised, but which was reserved for subsequent generations, when the Son of God, taking our nature upon him, was to bring life and immortality to light, himself leading the way, to be followed in it by those who should be found to be more immediately his. Till then, man was kept in deep darkness of ignorance respecting a future state of existence. Though very soon after the flood, God was pleased in a most especial manner to manifest his divine presence and afford his explicit directions for man's conduct through life, with a promise of rewards for obedience and a denunciation of punishment for transgressions. Those rewards and punishments were all of a temporal nature. The next step of man then was not, as now, to immortality. The directions of God, therefore, for his government were very different in their nature from those which we, as joint heirs with Christ of immortality, have received. The covenant which God made with them was a temporary covenant of blood, that which he hath since been graciously pleased to make with us in an everlasting covenant of love. We must not, therefore, be surprised that the permissions and even commands given to them by the Almighty under the preparatory law were such as would be inconsistent with that pure spiritual law, never to be broken, which hath been given by him when the fullness of the time was come to us. Thus far it hath appeared necessary to premise, in order to account for much of God's dealings with mankind previous to the advent of our Savior's appearance upon earth. Man, however, is not even now elevated to the state of exaltation and comparative perfection, for which, in the wise and merciful counsels of his God, he is declaredly destined. He has indeed received at the hands of his Savior a religion that is pure and perfect, but he has corrupted it, till it now often scarcely retains a trace of its original simplicity and pure spiritual nature. His Savior and Lawgiver hath already appeared in humility on earth, to set him an example of perfection, that he might, if he would, follow his steps. Man, however, hath forsaken the path in which the Savior strove to lead him. That despised and forsaken Savior, we are nevertheless taught, will again appear on earth, but in power and in great glory. Then will man attain to his utmost state of earthly perfection and felicity. Then will the religion of Christ be stripped of all those encumbrances and defilements with which mistaken zeal, vanity, folly, and worldly mindedness have disguised and corrupted it. Then will there remain nothing to keep sincere believers from worshiping God in union and brotherly love together. They will then be all of one mind and of one spirit. It will then be no longer necessary to say, "Know the Lord," for all will then know him and be taught of him. Thus then, it hath been attempted to be shown that it is the plan of divine providence gradually to advance, on the whole, man on earth in the scale of mortal existence, notwithstanding the many instances of partial deterioration, which many cause some to claim. Where is the promise of his coming? To return, however, to the earlier stages of man's existence on earth. So little advancement appears to have been made before the flood in any of the arts and sciences that it is probable that the antediluvians were totally unacquainted with any kind of writing. Noah must have been ignorant of any such art, or the method would have become general among all his descendants and in the rising nations of the infant world. This evidently was not the case, for they eventually adopted different methods of so conveying information to distant people. How early alphabetical writing was invented and practiced seems not discoverable, though it was probably not very long after the flood. Rocks and stones and iron pens seem to have been the earliest rude implements employed. In this art, the Egyptians appear to have been the most deficient. Hieroglyphical writing, that which they adopted and in which they preserved, being the most imperfect and tedious methods of all others. This, however, it is probable, was the first system practiced. In those primeval times, it appears to have been God's method himself to give more immediate direction than in these latter ones. And it is far from improbable that a nation making such rapid progress in intellectual attainments as Egyptians did had been favored, in an especial manner, by divine communications of the will of God. But that, like the Jews in latter times, they forsook their divine king and lawgiver, electing a man for their king and stocks and stones for their gods. That the former was the case, within less than 400 years from the flood, is evident from the relation of the life of Abraham, who fled to Egypt for preservation from famine, and was there noticed by its king. Thus early began the connection between the Egyptians and the Jews, even in the lifetime of the great father and founder of the latter nation. This connection, it appears to me, has never once entirely ceased during almost 4,000 years, nor probably ever will cease to the end of time. That the Egyptians were the first, or among the first idolaters, seems very certain, as well as that they were instrumental in leading the Israelites into the same abominable practice. This early connection, thus begun in sin, has ever since served constantly to display to the rest of the world the power, the faithfulness, the justice, the steadfastness, and finally the mercy of Almighty God. All these have been displayed, and are still displaying in a manner too remarkable to be overlooked, and too strong and clear to be misconceived excepting by the most prejudiced or inattentive observer. These wonderful and according miracles have not only been exhibited by the people of both these nations in almost all the countries of the earth, but they have been exhibited in such a manner as that none might plead ignorance of their existence, the one people having been driven by the arm of the Almighty into the cities of all lands, and the other, as predicted, into the open fields of the same, yet that they might not again tempt each other to offend, though thus brought near together in all countries, they have in all been kept so separate as to remain ignorant that they were the two people for ages united in working iniquity, each still remaining in that predicted mental darkness inflicted upon them till the time appointed for their enlightenment shall arrive. Awful, tremendous, and appalling indeed, it seems, are to be the circumstances by which the final restoration of the Jews is to be ushered in. It would seem as if all the nations of the earth were to be cast into the fiery furnace of God's justice, there to be all amalgamated into one mass, in order that all impurities may be carried off by absorption, or in base dross, till the residue be purer than fine gold itself. For the elect's sake, however, it may be that those days may not only be shortened, but much of the dreadful inflictions remitted. The state in which the Jews have remained during almost 2,000 years has been considered, I believe, almost universally as miraculous, because it is considered that, in what is called the natural course of events, they must, in many instances at least, have become incorporated with the people of the countries in which they have, for hundreds of years, resided. Admitting this in respect of the Jews, how is it possible not to draw the same inference from the equally extraordinary state in which, for many hundreds of years, another people, the Gypsies, have remained dispersed throughout almost every country in the world, and kept equally with the Jews a distinct and separate people, rarely intermarrying with others, and never amalgamating or becoming incorporated with the inhabitants of any countries in which they have so long resided? We have seen that prophecies equally clear and strong by the same prophets foretell the extraordinary dispersion and continuance as a separate people of the Egyptians as fully as they do those of the Jews. both prophecies likewise foretelling the final restoration to and exaltation of each of these people in their own original countries. Either then, we must give up the assumed conclusion that the state of the Jews proves a miraculous interference, preserving their continuance as a distinct people under their extraordinary circumstances, or we must admit the no less extraordinary circumstances of the Gypsies to have an equal claim to a miraculous foundation. Taken together, they appear mutually to support and elucidate each other, and it seems to me that they must stand or fall together. The condition of the Jews as foretold, and as it at this time exists, is a stupendous display of almighty power exhibited century after century to all the nations of the earth in their towns and their cities. The condition of the Gypsies as descendants of ancient Egyptians is an equally stupendous display of the same almighty power exhibited century after century to almost all the same nations of the earth in their open fields. When, then, we contemplate these, the two mightiest among the nations of the early post-diluvian world, intimately connected from their commencement, both most highly offending their almighty Creator, and both consequently drawing down upon their guilty heads, thousands of years ago, the most extraordinary denunciations that ever were uttered by the voice of man in obedience to the commands of God, the stupendousness of the event becomes increased in a manifold degree. When also it is further considered that these denunciations were to be thousands of years in fulfilling, and that the events predicted were of a nature such as the imagination of man could scarcely either have conceived or admitted, and yet further, that they both did commence at the time foretold, that century after century, through more than 2,000 years, they have continued to proceed in their predicted and appointed course towards their final important consummation. The magnitude and astonishing nature of the miracle seem even further increased. It is yet more so when it is considered that these extraordinary events, so far from being promoted or willingly furthered by the people or governments of the countries into which the strangers obtruded themselves, have almost invariably been opposed and attempted to be frustrated by them. Farther, this miracle appears still more astonishing when it is considered that these two extraordinary people have been so far from aiding each other in obtaining entrance into and remaining in the respective countries in which they had taken refuge, that they are almost the only people who have never had any communication with each other. The one, as predicted, pertinaciously adhering in poverty to the open fields of every country in which they were scattered, whilst the others with equal pertinacity sought refuge and riches in the most populous towns and cities, avoiding the open fields and a pastoral life as an abomination. Thus are these two once mighty people, who, in the earlier ages of the world, were continually transgressing together the commandments of their almighty Creator, and uniting to substitute the workmanship of their own hands in the place of Him who made the heavens and the earth, cast out and dispersed throughout all the earth, without a temple, an idol, an image, forsaken of God, obtruders, contemned and persecuted, a byword and a reproach to the most despicable of mankind, a dreadful and notable example of the vengeance of an offended God, spread throughout the cities and the fields of almost every land on the face of the earth, and doomed so to continue till such an impressive example shall be no longer necessary. Of all the numerous other nations contemporaries with and opposed to the Jews, which have since ceased to exist as nations, the people have in no one instance continued distinct to the later times. They have invariably been destroyed, lost among or incorporated with their conquerors, nor were there any prophetic intimations that they should so continue. The Jews and the Egyptians were the only two people whose perpetuation to after times was foretold, with the manner of each, and they too alone have so continued, and continued with those extraordinary peculiarities and wonderful circumstances attached to them, in which the prophets foretold that they should long remain. All these unprecedented events, having occurred exactly as predicted many ages before, afford strong presumptive evidence, if not assurance, that the remainder of the extraordinary prophecies will, in due time, be equally fulfilled. The time when, and the manner how, are not so clearly foreshown. Many reasons may be assigned, and others probably exist unknown to us, why in these respects man should be kept in ignorance till the fullness of the time is come. Then all mysteries may and probably will be cleared up, and the wisdom and mercy, as well as importance of the predicted and then accomplished events, will be manifested to the astonished and adoring world. The character of the Gypsies, as it has been here described, appears to me to be so extraordinary for a whole race of people so situated as they are, scattered among all nations and dispersed in all countries, that I think nothing but the fiat of the Almighty, impressing it upon them for a particular purpose, can possibly account for it. All their propensities, their habits, and their manners are calculated for a people doomed to a continuance in such a state, and for such a people only. While so strong are those propensities, those habits, and those manners, that no measures, however severe or violent, have yet been able to eradicate or weaken them. If the Gypsies could obtain a livelihood without ever coming in contact with other people, it seems as if they would rather do so. Nay, they will submit to the greatest and most severe privations rather than be compelled to such an alternative. When they are driven to it, it seems that their object is to retire from it again as soon as the means of so doing can be acquired. If by the severity of the weather or other causes they are forced to seek refuge under less penetrable roofs than those of their frail, slight tents, they never resort to the common lodging houses among the depraved vagrants of towns. They obtain a room to themselves, however mean it may be. They dwell as retired and unknown as they can, and they leave their prison house like the earliest sportive denizens of the air, on the first gleam of sunshine, to enjoy their beloved freedom in the refreshing breeze of the opening spring, erecting their own simple endeared habitation in the verdant lane, under budding hawthorn, by the side of a sparkling stream, whose banks are sweetened and embellished by the violet and the primrose, while the heavens smile over their heads with renewed splendor, and the whole welkin rings with the awakened notes of love and harmony and delight. Oh, can we hold beings like these in scorn and contempt? This unconquerable love of freedom and of the country is not felt in the same degree by any other people on the face of the globe as it is felt by the Gypsies universally, and has been so through all the ages since they were first known. It seems inseparable from their nature, and must have been impressed upon it for some good purpose by Almighty Power. What that purpose is, I think no one can now doubt. There seems likewise to have been given to them a degree of intellectual power possessed by no other people at all in the same low station, with a freedom from cringing meanness or abject servility, which tends greatly to preserve them a free and independent people. Though they will accept of alms, and even ask for them, it is in general only of such persons as happen to come in their way. They rarely, if ever, beg from door to door or in towns, and never with a whining or fictitious distress. It is an extraordinary circumstance that, however distressed, they rarely apply for that legal relief which they might demand. There is an unaccountable quickness and clearness of understanding possessed by them, which can not only enables them to express themselves clearly, but also to turn the failings of others to their own account. At the same time, their language is neither profane nor vulgar, but generally such as is proper and approaching to refinement. Though they cannot be accused of false modesty, to those who do not encourage ribaldry, their language is seldom other than decent and unassuming. On all occasions they seem to avoid giving unnecessary offense in conversation. Since they have ceased to be persecuted and hunted as wild beasts, or to be considered as houseless thieves and vagabonds, few instances of convictions of real gypsies have been known. To these qualities, contributing to fit them for their assigned station in the open fields of all countries, may be added their unprecedented contentedness with the very scantiest, meanest, and even most revolting food, not, as has been said, because they prefer it, but, as Boswell said, because they are often very ill off for want of victuals of any kind, and must therefore put up with such as they can get. Their abstemiousness and contentedness with little and mean food is requisite for a people who are doomed, like them, to be cast into and remain in the wilderness and the open fields. Such a people, one might suppose, would be an idle race. This is not the case, generally speaking. They are industrious so far as they can be so consistently with their decreed stations in the world, so that there are a few trades which it admits of which they do not follow. They do not seek to eat the bread of idleness, but they will not drag the chains of slavery. If it were not for their industry, they could not appear so decently clad as they very generally do, nor with the comfortable accommodations which they often possess. That God, who has thus decreed for a time the continuance of these people in this extraordinary state of separation from the rest of mankind in all the countries throughout which he has scattered them, has been mercifully pleased to add a peculiar blessing to their obedience, the blessing of almost uninterrupted health. They are rarely sick, generally live to a good old age, sometimes to a very great one, and are then generally taken good care of. To medicines and medical men they are strangers. Healthy during life, they are generally removed from it without paying the tax which wealth imposes, that of procrastinated sufferings to themselves and anxious misery to their friends. They move from place to place, but not in search of health, for they take it with them, while the sons and daughters of affluence spend their time and their money, and often the money of others, in the vain search after it. The gypsies, therefore, need not forsake their assigned station to be near the doctor. Temperance, exercise, fresh air, and freedom from the cares attendant on acquiring, keeping, or spending wealth are to them preservatives better than the most efficacious remedies. Their women suffer but little from childbearing, and their children little from nursing. When stationary, the infants are left pretty much to take care of themselves or one another, and when on the tramp, a bag on the mother's back serves both to hold them and to preserve the free use of their limbs. A naturally deformed gypsy is scarcely known. Both men and women are well shaped. The young women, though often both elegantly formed and handsome, are rarely, if ever, found as common prostitute in town. They generally marry young among themselves. The foregoing circumstances are all calculated to keep the gypsies attached to that station and mode of living, which seems clearly to have been assigned them. To these, however, other peculiar propensities or habits may be mentioned as contributing to the same effect. They have no desire to practice or obtain those arts which embellish and elevate men in society, though if asked, they would generally say that they should like to learn to read. Yet I believe that they have rarely, if ever, been eager to do so, or to accept of an offering of being taught, or even of having their children instructed. The fact is that there appears evidently to be an innate avoidance of everything that would seem to have a tendency to draw them into more intimate connection with other people. Of this, perhaps, they themselves may not be fully aware. It, however, is so and must be necessary to produce and to continue for so long a period an anomaly so striking in human nature. They never seem to make the least attempt to delineate any objects in any way. They know nothing of poetry, though one would suppose, passing the life that they do, and possessing the strong sense and feelings which they certainly have, they would be sure not only to make attempts, but to succeed in an eminent degree in poetry, since almost the rudest nations have essays of the kind. They, however, have not even any oral traditionary tales, either in verse or in prose, nor do they seem to have the least taste for hearing such repeated. They are no singers, not even to their own children, yet are they so far from being deficient in either ear or taste for music that a very many of men are performers in the violin. This art, however, they only pursue as a calling which may be followed without forsaking their itinerant life or rural station. The fiddle is never heard in their tents for the gratification of their family. It is with them an instrument of profit, not of amusement. There is, too, a peculiar sedateness and seriousness in their manners and conversation. They are very rarely heard talking lightly or laughing among each other. Yet I apprehend they think but little on religious subjects, nor are they influenced, it appears in general, by religious motives. They would perhaps rather avoid talking at all respecting it, as they never introduce it. Nor are they, I apprehend, in the habit of praying. But when questioned respecting religion, they never speak lightly or irreverently of it. Nor are they addicted to common swearing. But as regards religion, they seem influenced, as in most other things, by a desire to remain unmolested and to avoid giving offense. They therefore profess to accord with the views of the people among whom they are scattered. Baptism appears to be the only religious act respecting which they are in any degree really anxious. I believe that they in general wish to have that ceremony performed. As to marriages, if they can have them performed in a church, they would, in most instances, prefer it. But if want of money or other circumstances seem to stand in the way, they scruple not, as before observed, to pledge their faith and take each other's word, such marriages being held inviolable amongst them. If felt to themselves, I believe that they very rarely attend divine service, even when encamped near a church. Like their fellow offenders and sufferers, the Jews, their eyes appear to be blinded, and their hearts hardened for their transgressions, till God's time shall come for their conversion and healing. In both instances, the heart seems totally unmoved by any feelings of affection or desire of communion with God. This circumstance in either people would be remarkable, but as applying to both, it is most extraordinary. Regular as the Jews may often be in their attendance on public worship, it seems clearly with them only a prescribed ceremony, with which the heart has nothing to do. All the circumstances which have been here related as regards the Gypsies seem to me most clearly to prove them to be, as before said, a people ordained by the divine decree to be scattered among the nations and dispersed in all countries, in the open fields thereof, so to remain unchanged during a certain period said, in the language of prophecy, to be 40 years. All their singular habits, their propensities, their feelings, as here stated, are such as to fit them for and continue them in such a state. Nay, the proceedings of the rulers of the numerous nations and countries in which they have been dispersed and scattered for so many years seems to have been overruled to contribute to the remaining, though many of these proceedings were expressly designed to extirpate them. There is scarcely a country in Europe in which severe edicts have not been passed against the Gypsies, decreeing their punishment and expulsion. In one instance, however, have they succeeded. In England, many penal laws were enacted against them, and very great numbers were executed for no other crime but being Gypsies. At one Suffolk assize, no less than 13 of these poor wretches were executed together, legally convicted of being born of Gypsy parents. By these means, however, the race was not expelled, though many of them were driven for a time to seek a more secure asylum in the Peak of Derbyshire and other unfrequented parts of the country. No sooner, however, were the persecutions abated than they resumed their former circuits. On any supposition but that of a miraculous interdiction, restraining the Gypsies from leaving, till the appointed time, the open fields of any of the nations through which they are scattered, or any one of the countries in which they are dispersed, it is impossible to account for such a pertinacious adherence, at the risk of liberty and life, to habits which to almost all other people would appear appalling. They were not required even by their oppressors to do anything respecting which they had any conscientious scruples, or to which they could have any reasonable strong objections, but only to live and labor as others did. It seems, however, that they were restrained from so doing by an unseen almighty power, and therefore no compulsion has been able to counteract the decree of omnipotence. End of chapter. Let's head over to the next video where the author now will give us a little description of a Gypsy family. Make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe.